Good afternoon. This is Ann DeSaro welcoming you to the Professional Development Series, the fall webinar series that the New York State Coalition for the Aging, in cooperation with the New York State Association of Area Agencies.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon. This is Ann DeSaro from the New York State Coalition for the Aging. We are pleased this afternoon to bring you the final edition of our professional development webinar series. The topic today is person-centered planning. These webinar series has brought you online education for professionals in the field of aging, brought to you by the New York State Coalition for the Aging, in cooperation and with support from the New York State Association of Area Agencies on Aging, and it's funded by a grant from the New York State Office for the Aging. We're very pleased to have been working for this entire series, four-part series, with the Professional Care Management Institute in Pennsylvania that has a long history of providing training to organizations working in the human services field, but particularly in the aging field, and they bring to us through these webinars a great deal of experience and expertise that we have benefited from so far, and I'm sure this afternoon we will learn quite a bit in our person-centered planning session that we're about ready to undertake. This webinar will be recorded, and the PowerPoint slides that our leader, Brad Levan, is going to present are now currently on the website of the New York State Association of Area Agencies on Aging, and that website is www.agingny.org. I'd like to introduce Brad to you before we start here. We're going to be talking about person-centered planning, and we've been given a lot of thought to how we actually do our work with our clients, and this is some thoughts on that topic. The way we conceptualize structure and the delivery of service and supports to people has evolved over the years. Currently, a person-centered approach has come to the foreground, and for good reasons. With more sophisticated management systems, complex funding sources, and computerized data systems comes the risk that we forget we are serving people. This program will discuss the importance of putting persons first by coming to a more fully understand that person. And our instructor today is Brad Levan, who is the Executive Director of the Professional Care Management Institute, and has worked in the field of human services, holding positions in aging, drug education and prevention, remediation for adjudicated delinquents, counseling, and preschool daycare for over 20 years. This experience has served him well as he's provided services to other agencies, including consultation, planning, problem solving, program evaluation, training, and curriculum development. Brad has studied at the Empire State College and SUNY for 5 years, and he received his Master's of Human Service degree from Lincoln University. We're very fortunate to have him with us today, and I'd like to introduce Brad, but first I wanted to tell you that we will have the opportunity for questions throughout this webinar. Brad will actually stop twice during the presentation of the webinar for us to be able to pass along any questions that you might have, and we will also have time at the end for questions. There is a box on the panel on your right that says questions, and you may type a question in there, and I can see that question and I will relay it when we take the break for questions. Please think about questions as we're going along here, because then it's most helpful for us to be able to pass those questions on to Brad. So with that, Brad, we're very happy to have you and very interested to hear what you have to say today.
Well, thank you, Ann. It certainly is a pleasure for me to be here today and have the opportunity to share some of my thoughts and some of the things that I know about person-centered planning. You were actually being kind when you said it was 20 years in human services. I actually started working in human services in 1970, so that's a bit longer than 20 years. When I do classroom training anymore, it seems like there are many people there who haven't even been born when I started training. I've actually been working in the field of aging, however. It will be 20 years coming up this March, and that's when I took over the helm as the director of PCMI. During that 20 years, I've had the opportunity to train care managers, assessors, and their supervisors, both in Pennsylvania and in New Jersey for a short period of time. Most recently, we've had the experience of training service coordinators from the Disability Network and care managers from Aging together. And it was interesting because we learned a lot from each other with that particular experience. So a lot of my thinking has been tested in those recent areas. Excuse me. One of the things I want to start with is something that I think is very indicative of how our field has changed over the years. I teach at Lincoln University, and I have students who come in and they oftentimes refer to the people that they're working with one of these four terms. They're either clients, consumers, one of the more recent ones is participants, and I've come to understand that even more recent is the term members. What I've come to understand about those terms is they were all designed and aimed at trying to find a way to be respectful of the individuals that we serve. Today, however, I'm likely to use the term consumers most frequently. It's the term that I'm most familiar with and most comfortable with. And I think it's the term that I would want people to use if they referred to me. With that said, today's focus is on the people side of person-centered planning. I'm not really going to be talking a whole lot about the administrative sides of that. I will be contrasting the people side with the administrative side because I think there's some important distinctions that we need to pay attention to. More specifically, I'm interested in spending time talking about how do we make it easier to understand what the frontline workers have to do. And I'm choosing the term frontline workers very purposefully. With that term, I'm talking about the people who come into face-to-face contact with the folks that we serve. And you'll see that term come up a little bit later in the presentation today. I want to put some of this presentation into a larger context. I think it's important for us to know that this concept of person-centered really is an approach that evolved in the disabilities field probably starting in the late 70s. There are some who would argue a little bit earlier than that. But between about 1979 through about 1992, this is a term that really kind of came to the forefront. The reference that I'm using here is actually out of one of your universities in New York, Syracuse University. And I think it's actually a good one to follow up with if you're interested in some of the history around person-centered planning. Well, this particular concept grew and evolved over time. It wasn't fully developed at the outstart. It was something that took steps as it moved through people's thinking. What is it that we're trying to do here? And I think the first element was that of self-determination. That is an individual's right to make decisions for themselves, to have some say in what happens to them in their lives. Along with that came the notion of increased independence, that people were capable of being much more independent than they may have originally been thought of being able to do. We moved to consumer choice as another concept that came out of that. And then finally we moved to the concept of people first. And I have to confess, this was a difficult one for me when I first encountered it because I didn't understand the subtle nuances of it. Specifically, we're talking about the difference between a person with a disability versus a disabled person. And from my perspective, I couldn't quite see how that mattered. The more carefully I listened, however, I came to understand that if you don't put people first, then the disability is what folks really focus on, and the person becomes known or thought of in terms of their disability and not who they are as a total person. So all of these concepts are steps that we've taken to try to understand better ways to be respectful of and to correctly serve folks. Well, given the reality that impairments create disabilities, we know that there are other people who have functional impairments. And specifically, we know in the aging network that you're more likely to have functional impairments as you get older. In our system, however, the language is somewhat different. The terms that we use to describe people and what we're trying to accomplish are significantly different. We talk about autonomy. We talk about quality of life as opposed to quantity of life. I know my father, who's just turned 85, he's acutely aware that his quantity of life isn't nearly as important to him as his quality of life. We talk about the distinction between care versus case management. And I remember when that conscious choice was made here in Pennsylvania, that we weren't managing cases, we were attempting to manage the care that an individual might need. Within the larger context, we have some political realities that we're dealing with now. We know, for example, that the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services have said that person-centered planning is a process that's directed by the participant and intended to identify the strengths, capabilities, preferences, needs, and desired outcomes of the participant. And while that's being said, I think there are some interesting questions that come up in the larger context. For example, the section of the quote, directed by the participant. What does that actually mean? What does directing something actually mean? For me, that's an important question because I've worked in the field of aging. I automatically go to asking, is everyone capable of directing the process? Realistically, I know that that's not true. I know that there are some individuals who are dealing with severe enough cognitive impairment that they don't have ability to direct something. So I think we can get into the semantics of that and have battles about it for weeks on end. But I think the reality is that when you're doing person-centered planning, what you're looking at is a facilitated process. And I like the word facilitated because the root for facilitated, the Latin root is facile, which basically means to make easy. So for me, a person-centered process might not be one where every individual is able to direct it on their own. But the professional that's working with them can certainly work to make the process easier. And I think that's a more realistic view if you're a practitioner on the front line, that my job isn't to go in and do this, rather my job is to go in and facilitate a process that makes it easier for the consumer to create the kind of plans that will help them get to where they want to be. Another part of the larger context that we're dealing with is the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. This act mandates person-centered delivery of long-term services and supports. So soon it's not going to be an option. I think what we're going to be seeing is that this concept gets more and more institutionalized. Now, as it becomes institutionalized, as with many things, it runs the risk of taking on an administrative or bureaucratic feel to it. And I think that's one of the things that we're going to try to avoid with the things that we present today. So the specific agenda for today, I'd like to do an overview of the person-centered planning as a process and what it means as a process. I'd also like to talk a bit about the difference between a systems view of person-centered planning and the consumer's view, because they're significantly different. You can't do person-centered planning without some focus on the person, and we're going to talk about a tool or a way of thinking that might make it easy for workers to actually make person something that's real and dynamic and useful. And last but not least, we're going to talk a little bit about the values dynamic in a person-centered planning approach. the reality is that anytime we enter a consumer's world, we're taking values with us that the consumer hasn't explicitly asked to have us bring in. And if we're aware of what those values are and can learn to manage them, we actually take huge steps toward being able to do real person-centered planning. Okay, so what is person-centered planning? Is it just a slogan, a term that we use that's popular, the newest trend in how we decide we're going to call the work that we do with people? Is it some form of propaganda in terms of people want us to believe something, but there's not complete truth in it? We're really not going to allow people to do their own kind of planning. And that leads us to the question, is it really just a fantasy? Can you really do person-centered planning? And I would argue that the answer to that is yes, you can. It is very much an achievable process. But I think the key word here is process. First and foremost, it's a process that typically occurs between two or more people. And in most cases, it's primarily between two people. And it occurs in a relationship format. It's two people trying to help one person figure out how do I get from where I am to where I want to be, where I need to be. It's also more than a completed form. It's interesting. As I looked at some of the forms that are being used in New York, I realized that you have a history very similar to ours. We have enormously complex, detailed ways to assess people, ways to take that assessment data and to translate it into a care plan. And oftentimes, at least our experience here has been, that workers get caught up in trying to address the form. So this sense of, I've got to smile and be nice, but I've got to get the form completed. I've got to get the paperwork done. I've got to get the data down. It becomes one of the driving forces in the work that people do. And I think it's important to separate that out and say, no, it's not the completion of the form that makes for person-centered planning. The form is just simply a tool. And it doesn't matter what tool we use. The reality is that it's fundamentally a process, an interaction between two people. By the same token, it's more than a translation of assessment data. Regardless of the assessment tool that you're using, person-centered planning isn't just taking that data and plugging it into a database or a series of formulas or paper and pencil forms. It, once again, is that interactive process between people. So it's interactive. It's a process between people. It's more than completing the form, and it's more than the translation of assessment data into a plan. Now, at this point, I'm going to guess that there are probably some administrators who are getting really nervous because they're thinking, wow, that we have to do this stuff. We can't not do this stuff. And I think that's very true. But I think the reality is that the scales have tipped perhaps a little bit in the direction of paying attention to the stuff we have to get done in order to meet the obligations of our funding source or our regulatory sources. And I think the scale probably needs to tip back just a little bit. So realistically, this is an intervention, and I like the definition of intervention. It's an act or fact of getting involved so as to modify something, or it's any measure whose purpose is to improve, maintain, or remediate. And I think that in our field, maintain, improve, and remediate are really valuable concepts for us to remember. But this intervention does occur at two levels, one at the systems level and the other at the consumer level. At the systems level, this intervention allows us to basically unlock and bring some resources and services to consumers that if we don't go through these administrative processes, we can't get the resources and services to our consumers. So in one sense, the system understands that we have to have some level of standardization and that has to be aimed at consistent levels of quality. We don't want to develop a service system that differentiates in terms of the level of quality that people get in their services or resources, nor do we want to develop a system that just allows anyone in any particular situation to utilize services that might not be a good match for them. Now, as I say this, I recognize that there are times when there's a difference between what we say happens and what actually does happen. So I'm going to move on to the next slide for this one. So in one sense, on the systems level, this serves as a gatekeeping function. We have limited resources, and I haven't heard any legislator or governor or anybody say it recently that we're going to have tons and tons of additional money to put into things. So we're likely to be looking at a reality that the gate isn't even going to open as wide as it might have opened 2 years ago. Just to share what I mean about the difference between reality and what we say happens. I discovered in Pennsylvania something that really surprised me, which is that sometimes care managers were so frustrated at the lack of services that they actually could bring to people that they ended up giving services and ordering services that in fact the consumer didn't really need. And the classic example of this was home-delivered meals. My suspicion is that that still happens, that people are just so frustrated as I can't get what this person needs, and I want to give them something. And as I talk to care managers, they would admit to doing this. If you talk to administrators in the organizations where they work, you got the sense that, yes, they knew this was happening, but they didn't really want to publicize it because they understood the turmoil that their workers felt in not being able to have that sense that they were actually helping more. So once again, as a systems level intervention, it does serve as a gatekeeping function. The other thing that occurs at a systems level intervention is this concept of it being interdisciplinary in nature. So when we do person-centered planning, we're recognizing that we look at the person in terms of what their medical needs, what their psychosocial needs are, what kind of support caregivers might need, what service providers are there, what their economic situation is, and in some cases, even what their spiritual condition is. What I find interesting about this is that if you were to ask or to talk with most consumers and use the term, this is interdisciplinary in nature, I think for many of them, that just wouldn't matter. It's not that they wouldn't know what it was, but it's just not a term that they're concerned with. It's not the way that they tend to think. And I think this is a concept that really does come out of an administrative way of thinking about the situation. And that's going to have some implications down the road. Okay, so let's shift a little bit and let's talk about what this means in terms of consumer level intervention. Realistically, person-centered planning should focus on the goals and needs of the person, and it should be very individualized in its approach. It's also aimed at those earlier concepts that we talked about, that is choice, autonomy, self-determination, and self-direction. Additionally, at the consumer level, it is a plan to assist the consumer in maintaining or improving quality of life. And I want to talk just very, very briefly about this notion of a plan. Once again, I'm going to ask us to step away from the document that we submit and say, this is the plan, to the process that we have with the person where we've mutually worked to develop a plan that the worker and the consumer can both articulate in language that makes sense to them, regardless of the language that has to be used on a given form. I also want to spend a little time talking about this notion of quality of life. And back this up a second, because we said this is a plan to help assist the consumer in maintaining or improving quality of life. And for the people we work with, this distinction is an important one. we know that for many of our consumers, our efforts are really at helping them maintain where they are now because they're in a period of decline, and that period of decline will continue. So it's a matter of how do we slow it down and give them as much quality of life or help them create as much quality of life as they can. And in rare cases, perhaps not as rare as they used to be, we actually have the opportunity to improve someone's quality of life. Well, if we're going to do that, we need to know something about what quality of life actually is. And if you look at the literature on this and the research on this, you'll see that there are two major views. The first view is quality of life is what the person says it is, no more, no less. The second view of quality of life is that it's a measurement based on the people who are doing the measurement. And typically the people who are doing the measurement aren't consumers. They tend to be administrators in service delivery systems. They tend to be planners. They tend to be legislators. They tend to be people who are working at a larger system and congregate averages of what constitutes quality of life. So from that perspective, you would make arguments such as quality of life has to do with health care that's available in the geographic region, with economic stability within a geographic region. I mean, all those kinds of things make a great deal of sense for somebody who has to measure quality of life. But for the person, it could be very, very different than those things. I want to move to this couple other definitions. And some of these concepts started, as you can see from the reference here, as early as 1995. Quality of life is an individual's satisfaction or happiness with life in domains he or she considers important. And that's critical because not everybody sees the same domains as important. As I use that word, I recognize that many of the consumers that I've worked with and seen, that's not a term that they would use. What they would use is, well, this is what's important in my life. And for them, in fact, that is quality of life. It's interesting. Several years ago, my father had major surgery on his spine. He had spinal stenosis, and at the upper ages of 70s, I guess he was 78, 79, he had the surgery, and it was really difficult surgery for him to recover from. And when I asked him why, he went through all of this, what he said kind of stunned me, but it really spoke to the notion of what was important to him. For him, it was very simple. He wanted to be able to go work in his garden. And prior to the surgery, it wasn't something that he could do. There was too much pain, and there was a loss of mobility. So quality of his life for him had very little to do with public transportation. It had very little to do with many things that a community planner might look at. It was very, very simple. He wanted to be able to work in his garden, and that's what gave him satisfaction at that point in his life. We can also look at quality of life in terms of an international perspective. And by the way, I think this is a really good text for people to read. It's the Lassies, a husband and wife team, have done some real solid work on what quality of life means for older people globally. And they found that there are some real similar kinds of patterns and connections. Quality of life is used to describe responses to the intrinsic characteristics of an individual and the extrinsic social and economic environmental factors that affect well-being. Translation, it has to do with who that person is and how well that matches with their larger environment. I think the second piece of their definition resonates even more appropriately. It's a product of individual experience, which means that what one person perceives as good quality is not necessarily satisfying to another. So by definition, quality of life isn't something that can be imposed on an individual or group of individuals in terms of what the definition is. Rather, it's something that comes from them in their determination. This is what brings quality to my life. Okay, so person-centered planning has these two different elements. It has system needs and consumer needs. And by necessity, there's two very, very different perspectives with this. I want to point out that these perspectives are not mutually exclusive. They actually, I think, need to coexist. Now, as I move into this section, I also want to point out and remind you that if you have questions as we go along, you should probably be submitting those questions as they come to you. I'm choosing this particular slide as a way to do this because this slide and my thinking around it isn't without some controversy. On the left-hand side, what you'll see is a typical organizational chart. And when I say typical, I mean it in the context of it's the one that most people draw. When I do a training and I ask people, can you please draw an organizational chart, I almost always see the one on the left. And I think this is an important thing for us to understand. This is the one that's pervasive in our current culture. It's the one that people think about as how their organization actually operates. Realistically, however, this organizational chart isn't real. And what I mean by it's not real is the same thing I mean when I say the number 2 is not real. The number 2 only exists as a concept. You can't show me 2 in the real world. If you put a number 2 in a slide like I did, what you're actually doing is putting the numeral on. If you hold up 2 fingers, you're showing me 2 fingers. 2 is simply a concept, and it exists in the mental world as a concept. Organizational charts are the same way. This doesn't really exist anywhere except for in our thinking. And we choose to allow it to exist there because it has some utility and function, much as the number 2 does. If number 2 didn't have function, we just wouldn't use it. But it does. It lets us know what time it is. It lets us know what the date is. It lets us know if our paycheck is correct. Well, this particular organizational chart on the left does have function. But the function is primarily aimed at an administrative function. The first recorded history of this type of organization was actually when Moses was leading people across the desert. What Moses did is that there's just a whole lot of people here I got to keep track of, and I think the way I have to do this is I need to identify leaders of 10. So he would pick a leader who would be responsible for 10 other people. Now those 10 other people, when the group was large enough, they also had 10 people that they were responsible to. So what he created was a hierarchy of administrative control. And that's exactly what this model represents. We know that at the top is the leader, the agency director, the president, the CEO, whatever that title happens to be. And we know that as you go further and further down, people have responsibility for folks below them, but not for folks above them. Well, there are some subtle kinds of implications with this particular way of thinking about an organization and the people who are in it. Our culture reinforces this with the language that we use. Everybody knows it's better to be on the top than the bottom. I mean, we have career ladders so that you can climb them to get to the top. We have lots and lots of concepts around this notion that to be successful means that I keep rising higher and higher in the organization. We also know that people who get paid more are the people at the top. Conversely, the people at the bottom typically don't get paid as much. They typically end up feeling somewhat devalued in relationship to other people in the organization. And it's not uncommon for me to hear people, frontline staff members, say they feel like they carry the weight of the organization. So there are some kind of negative connotations that go with this. The positive side is that it does give you a structure for administrative accountability. Now, that's a systems need way to look at things. If we shift, however, and we look at a consumer's needs, the first thing I noticed about the chart on the left is the consumer doesn't even exist there. They don't show up. Now, the chart on the right is the same kind of conceptual model that the one is on the left. That is, it doesn't exist in reality. It's simply a way to think about things. The difference is that in this particular model, the consumer is in the center of what we do. the reality is that if we don't have consumers, we're out of business. We just don't have any work to do. Now, if you look at this particular chart, you'll see that the next level out from the consumer is what I'm calling the direct line level personnel. These are the people who have the most contact with consumers. They know the most about what's actually going on in the consumer's world. You move out a level from that, and you have the folks who supervise these direct line level personnel. And this is typically a middle management. Now, in our field, oftentimes supervisors still know a lot about consumers because they used to be direct line level personnel, and some of them may even carry a caseload today. But the reality is that the further they move away from that center where the consumer is, the less they actually know about what's taking place with consumers today, because their attention is now being focused on even further outrings, and that is administrative things. They serve a function of how do I take the information that the direct line personnel give me and push that further out for decision makers, and how do I filter information from upper management down to line level personnel in a way that it doesn't distract them from the work that they're doing. And as we move further out, we get to the administration, and realistically, the administration knows even less about what's taking place with consumers. Now, you could add additional circles to this. You could add regulators and funders outside of administration. And once you do this, now you're recognizing that they likely know even less about what's taking place in the consumer's world. The implication for all of this kind of resides in some very simple things. When I look at the chart on the right, the first thing that occurs to me is the most important person in the organization besides the consumer is the direct line level personnel. Without them, we can't do our jobs. They are the link to our ability to actually do person-centered planning. They know more and more about what's taking place with the consumer than anybody else does. I typically like to describe this territory as sacred territory. And what I mean by that is that if they don't do this, no one else will, and that means that this territory is special. Their focus should always be toward the center, not away. And realistically, in this model, supervisors and middle management want to relieve any burdens that they can on folks that are coming from the outside so that they can focus their attention on the consumer. So this is a very different way of looking at an organization. But I think the implications for a person-centered planning are very clear, that there has to be a relationship that exists somewhere, and that relationship by nature will step outside of administrative concerns, and it will focus on people concerns. So once again, I think by necessity, we have to have two different perspectives about what person-centered planning means. Yes, there are regulations we have to meet. There are procedures for meeting those regulations. There are timelines for meeting those. They exist in the left side model. By the same token, that process of a face-to-face interaction with the person to help facilitate their planning doesn't belong on the left side. It belongs on the right side. So by necessity, two very different perspectives that are not, in my opinion, mutually exclusive. They have to coexist. And I have to be able to hold both of them in my thinking. Okay, so this is a point where I want to stop to see if there's any questions, because typically people do have some questions about that last slide or some of the things I've said so far. So why don't I check in to see if we have questions at this point. Anne, have we any questions? Okay, I'm not getting a response. So if you all will bear with me, I'm going to check to see if there's been a message left for me for some reason that I've missed. And I'm not seeing any of those, so I apologize for popping my screen out. And I am going to see if we can get back on track here and continue to the next.
Can you hear me, Brad?
I can hear you now, yes.
Okay, there are no questions.
Okay.
So you can go back.
All right, great. And I do want to remind people that if you do have questions or even comments about any of the things that we're presenting, please type them in as they occur to you. One of the things that's the most challenging about doing a presentation like this is that I don't get to see people's facial reactions to comments that I'm making. So I can't say things like, can you put words to that quizzical look that you have? And kind of encourage people to ask questions. So I'm going to have to assume that you all will make your comments and put your questions in as they occur to you.
And just as a reminder, it's the box that says questions that's in the panel to the right of the presentation that Brad is making. You type it in there and it'll appear on our screen, and then I can pass those questions on to Brad. So back to your content, Brad.
Okay, thank you, Ann. All right, I want to shift gears now, and I want to talk about this focus on the person. And what we've come to understand in our experience is that there's a handful of things that absolutely have to take place in order for somebody to do this. The first one deals with the concept of being engaged with that person, and we'll talk about that in more detail. I also have to be able to listen exquisitely well. That needs to be my first path, and I have to listen with more than just my ears. And what I mean by listening with more than just my ears perhaps can be described this way. I was once in the home of a person who was being asked, do you have any problems with ambulation? And he very confidently said, oh, absolutely not. That's not a problem for me at all. Yet when you watched him rise from his chair and attempt to walk across the room, it took him almost 8 to 12 minutes to get up out of the chair and across that 10-foot segment. But from his perspective, he didn't have problems with ambulation. So if you're listening with your eyes, you can see, okay, so for this person, they clearly do not ambulate as well as others do, but they're not making that an issue. And that's something I need to listen to for a variety of different reasons. I can't just assume that ambulation is terribly important to him. Perhaps it's not. But if I can't even recognize that there's a difference between what he says and what his body's capable of doing, then I don't have full access to what's taking place. The third thing I need to do is I need to facilitate. I need to work to make things easier. I need to be encouraging. And I don't mean encouraging just to the consumer. I mean encouraging to myself, to caregivers, and to anybody else who's involved with this individual. And last but certainly not least is I have to have the capacity to build trust. Now, as I said, we're going to talk about each of these in a little more detail. Before we do that, however, I want to share with you the acronym PERSON that we've come up with as we try to train people. How do you actually come to know a person? And it's important for us to keep in mind that no two people are the same. They're just not going to have the same needs, the same goals, the same desires, the same sense of what constitutes quality of life. So when we think about person, we think about personality, their ethnicity and culture, the roles, the strengths they have, the opportunities they have, and the needs they have. And in terms of personality, this is an important one. What is the individual's personality? Are they stoic? If somebody's stoic, it may be harder to find out what kinds of things they want because it's not something they're used to sharing. You could be working with somebody who's dependent. They don't know how to, perhaps it isn't they don't know how, but they're not used to being able to do things without someone else there to guide them. Recently, unfortunately, my family and I lost a friend who used to be a neighbor of ours, and in watching his wife deal with this, it's just astounding how dependent she was on him for all kinds of things, like who paid the bills, where the insurance policies were, just an enormous level of dependency. And it's not a weakness, it's just part of her personality. When she trusts somebody, she allows herself to become dependent on them. There are other personality characteristics that we want to look for as well. Is the person suspicious by nature? Are they cheerful? Are they rational? Are they impulsive? Are they friendly? Are they private? I mean, the list goes on and on. And I think personality is important to factor into it because I know that I don't respond the same way to all personalities. And I need to have a level of awareness that if I'm having a difficult time in a relationship, it may be due to personality. And the responsibility to shift capacity is mine. That means that I have to have the ability to work with different personalities. And that sometimes can take additional work on my part. But nevertheless, that's part of the reason that that territory that frontline people occupy becomes sacred territory, because they're the ones that have to understand the personality that they're dealing with and find ways that they can effectively deal with that personality. Ethnicity and culture. The interesting thing to me about ethnicity and culture is that we all have some. I didn't used to feel that way because I didn't have a strong sense of being French or Irish or German or any other kind of thing. I just thought, well, you're a typical American mutt. Your genes come from lots of different places. But the reality is that I do have ethnicity and culture, and with that ethnicity and culture, there are values that come into play. I do hold attitudes. I have beliefs, and there are customs that I participate in. All of us belong to different subgroups, even within our primary ethnicity and culture. Teaching at Lincoln University has been kind of an interesting thing for me. It's the oldest historical black university in the country, and I'm a white middle-class male. And one of the things that's been most interesting to me has been the sense of entitlement that I have that I didn't know that I had. But if you're a white middle-class male, it does have an impact on what you come to believe. I've never in my life questioned that I couldn't do, be, or go wherever I wanted to. That was just a given, and no awareness that that was the case. Well, I've come to understand that not everybody feels that way. Not everybody's had that same experience. If you are a woman, it's very likely that at some time, at some point in your life, somebody told you there were things that you weren't supposed to do. If you're a person of color, you've probably had similar experiences. But even within those groups, there are subcultures. There is no such thing as a singular African American community. There is no such thing as a singular Latino community. Rather, in any geographic area, there are lots of different communities of people. So we've had different experiences even within our ethnicity and culture. There is commonality, and the extent to which I can learn the commonality within a culture, that's valuable. By the same token, I've also got to recognize there's going to be some differences in those. One example that comes frequently with people we're working with has to do with food. It's amazing. You go into someone's home, and oftentimes they'll offer you food. You might make assumptions about why they're offering you food, and it can vary a great deal. Sometimes you're offered food because it's considered the polite thing to do, and the custom is that if you're in my home, you are my guest, and I am working to make you comfortable. But that's not always the reason that food is offered, and I kind of learned this the hard way. Sometimes food is offered because people are bragging. They make really good food, and they want you to know it. And that has less to do with your being comfortable than it is with them demonstrating or illustrating or saying, hey, I'm good at this. I've also been offered food by people who weren't offering food because they thought they were especially good at it or they were interested in my comfort. Rather, they were determined that they were going to meet what they thought was the status quo. So I'm good enough, I've got enough money, we've got enough resources. When people come, we're going to offer them food. And it wasn't about making me comfortable. It was about demonstrating to the world some level of capacity that they had. So my point being that even within a given ethnicity and culture, there can be a wide range of reasons for behaviors. I need to look for the foundation culture, what it means, and then I need to come to understand and look at the variations within that. Moving on, we know that roles are important parts of what people are and how they see themselves. We also know that with age, there comes more than just one or two shifts with the kinds of roles that you have. Some of these don't matter, but there are in fact meaningful roles, and they do change as we age. The question now comes up, well, which roles are important from the person's viewpoint? Not yours, but from theirs. So for me, for example, when my kids were finally old enough that they went off to college, there was a real role shift. I was no longer the day-to-day father who was there to give guidance, direction, set limits, advice, to be a good listener. And that was a shift for me in terms of a meaningful role, one that I wasn't necessarily pleased with having to make. Well, as I continue to age, I know that those role shifts are going to continue. At some point, I'll probably retire, and that means that who I am in the professional world will shift. It will no longer be the same. So when I look at somebody that I'm working with, I want to know something about the kinds of roles that are still important to them. Do they see themselves as a mentor? Do they see themselves as the fix-it person? There's a person in our neighborhood, I guess he's been retired for 15, 20 years now. If anybody has a question about how to fix something, they go to Jerry, because that's his role, and he takes great pride in that. Jerry recently had a stroke, and what's interesting is he didn't want to lose that fix-it role. He wanted to find a way that he could still be there for his neighbors when they had questions about how to do something. At the same time, a lot of his neighbors were reluctant to approach him because they were fearful that they'd be imposing on him, not understanding that it became a large part of his identity. So that's the other thing I want to look at when I'm looking at person. What are some of the meaningful kinds of roles that are in this person's life, and what can I do to maintain these, to help them keep them strong, and in some cases to reactivate a role that they may have valued in the past. And this can take place in very simple ways. I know, I'll use myself as an example again, that part of what I like to do with my sons was to be a mentor of sorts. Well, what I've discovered is that I can be a mentor in other places with other people. But unfortunately, I didn't discover that until I had somebody help me think through that and understand it. In effect, help me label part of what was missing. And I felt it, but I didn't have a language necessarily to label it and talk about it. So another part of this is looking at the roles that are meaningful to someone. Moving on to the next letter in person, that's the S letter for strengths. We tend to think about strengths in two ways. Internal strengths, and these are the characteristics that the person has inside of them. It's who they are. It can be somebody who has a sense of determination, somebody who's tenacious about something, somebody who has incredible patience, people who have a sense of humor about themselves, about life in general. And these are all internal kinds of strengths. And when I'm working with somebody and want to understand who that person is, I try to get a handle on what are these internal characteristics that allow them to be who they are, that allow them to continue to flourish. Now, one of the things that I know is that if you're an older person, you didn't get there unless you had some strength. It's just, I mean, somebody who's 70 years old didn't get to be 70 by accident. Some of those characteristics are there. And oftentimes, what other people see as a less than desirable trait, in fact, is a strength for that person. There's a gentleman that I know he could be very mean and very nasty. But what's interesting is it's not about being mean and nasty. It's about being protective and surviving. He has an extraordinary sense of, I will survive. Now, oftentimes he puts up walls that he doesn't have to put up, but they've worked for him in the past. They've kept him safe until he's decided that it's time to let the walls down. So sometimes when we see a personality characteristic that we don't necessarily like, we need to think about it differently. We need to think in terms of how has this served the person in a positive way? How has this been a strength for them? My wife would like to tell you that I can be very tenacious about some things. If I've set my mind on something, it's kind of hard to get me off of it. So while it can be difficult to live with, it's also something that served me really well. Now, in addition to the internal strengths, there are external strengths. And these are the things that are outside of the person. These are the things that exist in the person's environment. They can be things like friends or family, other types of relationships that they have with people. They can be things such as access to public transportation or the ability to get places. That's very much a strength. It allows me to take advantage of opportunities I couldn't otherwise. The level of health care I have available to me. The level of insurance is a strength. If I have better insurance, this is a good thing. The match between the living space that I have and my needs can be a strength. It can also be a challenge. But if I'm fortunate that I can live in a place where that environment is a match for who I am, what I need to do, what I like to do, that can be a real strength. In my parents' case, for example, when they moved to a single-floor house, that became an external strength. They no longer had to navigate steps. So I want to take a look at the kind of strengths that I'm dealing with. Those internal characteristics, the personality of the person, the things that have served them well, and then the things on the outside that help them maintain or improve their quality of life. Moving on to the O. What are the opportunities that exist for this person? What possibilities exist? What choices do they still have? And what might be available now that wasn't before? It's interesting. As you work with people, you come to understand that opportunities aren't always easy to see. But the reality is that if we still have choice, then in fact there are opportunities. We get to choose in many subtle kinds of ways. Sometimes the choices aren't exactly what we want, but we still need to look for them. What are the things that are available? What are the possible paths that we can take? And these are going to vary for every individual. They're not going to be the same for any one person. What someone sees as an opportunity, you might not see as an opportunity. So once again, you need to come to understand how they see the choices they have in front of them. Moving on to the N, the needs. We've actually gotten fairly sophisticated in the field of aging at identifying needs. In fact, I doubt there are very few people who do this better than we do. We find really sophisticated tools to use, and we train people really, really well to look at the kinds of needs that people have. And these can be for very basic things: food, shelter, subsistence. Do people have needs for assistance in their daily activities? And we've gotten sophisticated. We can call these ADLs and IADLs. And we also have come to understand that people have emotional and intellectual needs. Quality of life can be very dependent on whether these needs are met as well. Is the person getting the kind of emotional support and interactions they want? Are they getting the kind of intellectual stimulation they need? Or in some cases, are they getting a break for some of the intellectual stimulation? Needs for affection, stimulation, security, an environment that fits them, control, all of these things would fit into the needs category. And as I said, I think this is an area that we've kind of excelled at. We're pretty good at understanding the needs that people have. So, realistically, person-centered plan can't exist if we don't see the person. And that means we need to see their personality, their ethnicity. Let's just walk us through the roles that they have, the strengths that they have, the opportunities they have, and the needs that they have. I'm going to draw from the strengths-based curriculum that PCMI uses to talk a little bit about some of the critical skills that you really need to try to have in place if you want to come to see the person and build the relationship with them so that you can use a person-centered approach to planning. The first one is a term that I used earlier, engagement. And when I use the term engagement, I'm using it in a very specific way. For me, engagement is the ability to very quickly develop a relationship with somebody, and that relationship has to be strong enough that they're willing to trust me enough to work with them. And that's key. I don't have to be best friends. I don't have to do anything other than be trustworthy enough to actually participate in this planning process with them. Now, as we've looked at engagement, we've come to understand that it has several elements to it. One of them is authenticity. And that people can see through somebody who's being a fake very, very quickly. They can tell when you're not being authentic. So I need to be who I am. I need to be a real person. And while I have a professional role, I can't pretend to be something that I'm not if I want to be perceived as authentic. So you've had the opportunity to listen to me for several minutes today already, and what you hear is who I am. I mispronounce some words. I repeat words sometimes. I tell stories about people that I know. I have opinions about things. I attempt to present myself as somebody who's authentic. And I think that's a really important thing for frontline workers to do as they're trying to build engagement with their consumers. Secondly, I need to have some level of expertise. The individual must believe that I actually know enough about what I'm there to do that I can be useful to them. So I actually have to do my homework. I need to have a skill package, a knowledge base that provides a level of expertise that makes it important or worthwhile for this consumer to want to engage with me. The third thing that I need to do is I need to be non-judgmental. I can't make judgments about the goodness or the badness of that person or their life. That's not my job. My job is to be there to facilitate for them. And if they perceive judgmental behavior on my part, it's very hard to build levels of engagement. Now, unfortunately, most of us give ourselves away with our behaviors, even if we try not to. So something as simple as rolling your eyes or a sigh can be perceived as being very judgmental. So one of the things I like to do is I like to have people practice using body language that doesn't come across as judgmental and getting feedback from other people about how did that appear to you. For me, it's been very valuable to work with people in doing that because it's very, very small little things that we do that give us away when we're being judgmental. And I think the last part of engagement is we can't have hidden agendas. We can't go in with the assumption that we know what's going to happen. We know how this is going to play out. We really need to be open to the consumer's agenda, not ours. I think this has some relevance given the administrative side of what has to take place in person-centered planning. And that is that we have to complete paperwork. There are certain administrative things that we have to get done. Well, I want to combine my authenticity and my expertise with this, and I want to tell people I have to get this paperwork done, and I want to be authentic in how I do that. But I also want the expertise to know how to get the paperwork done in a way that matches where they are. So if we have to take longer to do something, that's great. By the same token, if I have somebody who wants me in and out of there as quickly as possible, that's fine. I don't need to build, work on building a long-lasting relationship with somebody if that's not what they're looking for. So I don't want to have that kind of hidden agenda. I want to put, this is what we have to do. These are the requirements that we have to do. We have to meet. And I want to make sure that that's not stuff that's hidden. Forrest and Palmer House, who are two well-known writers around strength-based theory, and I think their empowerment skills for family workers is well worth reading if you haven't had a chance to do that. They say that engagement means I have to listen with empathy. I need to try to put myself in what does it feel like to experience what they're experiencing. I don't want to feel sorry for anybody, but I do want empathy for people. I need to understand the nonverbal communication. I need to watch people, and I need to ask them to label. You know, you just kind of cocked your head and went, ah, and you sighed. Can you tell me what you're experiencing with that? So I need to try to come to understand what nonverbal communication means. I need to say what I mean as clearly and as respectfully as possible. Promote cooperative solutions. There will be times when consumers will want things we can't do, and that requires some problem solving on our side. How do we find ways that we can collaborate and cooperate to make progress with something? I think this next one's very important. Handle blame and criticism. This can be extremely difficult when you have a consumer who's upset and who's taking that out on you, who's angry and they're taking that out on you. I think the important thing to remember here is that they don't really know you. This isn't about you. It's about them and their need to express something somewhere. So I have to have the capacity to handle that, to tell myself internally, this isn't about me, this is about them, and I can actually facilitate this process by allowing them to process this blame and criticism that they have. I need an ability to talk about sensitive issues. I have to be comfortable with that. I have to recognize that, in fact, some issues are comfortable. I just got a little note here that says audio connection restored, so I'm not sure where it may have dropped out. So I'm going to back up to the beginning of this slide. Forrest and Palmer House is saying that we need to listen with empathy, which is different than feeling sorry for somebody. It's coming to understand how they feel about a situation. Yes.
Brad, this is Ann.
Yes.
We heard you, so you can
Okay,
go right.
You got that?
You don't
All
need
right,
to
so
go
the
back
note that I got I can ignore. Great.
Yes.
Last but not least, I need appropriate self-disclosure. This is a big one, I think, in engagement. The only time self-disclosure is acceptable or even desirable is when it helps the person come to understand their situation. Self-disclosure should never be about you. Yet I've watched care managers who are talking with, oh yeah, that happened to me too. Well, you wouldn't believe, and it ends up being about the care manager, not about the consumer. So I can use self-disclosure as a way to engage people, but it has to be appropriate. It has to be designed to model or to help the consumer understand you're not the only person who has these kind of experiences or feelings. And in that case, self-disclosure is definitely an appropriate thing. When we talk about the ability to identify strengths, I like to think about this in terms of three different kinds of factors that go into identifying strength. The first one are, what are the risk factors? What are the things that put quality of life at risk? And as I said before, we're pretty good at identifying and isolating these things. We can come to understand that, yes, you can't ambulate the way that you used to. You can't prepare your own food. You don't know how to shop for food, whatever they are. I know what the risk factors are. These are the things that threaten quality of life. There are two other sides of this I need to look at. One is the protective factors, and these are the things that help protect quality of life. These are the things that make quality of life doable. It brings it into existence. They can be things like the friends and family that I have. They can be passions that I have. I might have passion about music. I might have passion about baseball. I could have passion about gardening, as my father did. They could be things like pets. Protective factors can also be things like income insurance. I don't want to forget rituals. People have rituals that maintain and help improve quality of life. One of my rituals is coffee, and it really does make a difference in terms of quality of life. If I reach a point where I can't make coffee or get coffee, I'm going to have to figure out how to deal with that. Quality of life can, protective factors can also be the personal habits that somebody has. So all of these things protect people. They're the things that when quality of life is threatened, these make a difference. They can make the challenges of the risk factors more bearable, more easily solved. Regenerative factors, however, are a little bit different. These are more remarkable kind of characteristics that people have that actually help repair them after they've experienced damage. Some of the ones I put down here: faith, love, trust, courage, resilience, ability to forgive. These are the kinds of things that when there's been real hurt, they make a difference. One of the things I find interesting is when a spouse loses a spouse, oftentimes the love of that spouse that they've lost is a single thing that keeps them moving forward. They believe that this is what she would have wanted me to do, or this is what he would have wanted me to do. And what they're drawing on is that regenerative factor of the love that they have for that person. There are people out there with amazing faith, and they rely on their faith to help repair them. So for people, for example, of a given faith, something as simple as lighting a candle on a daily basis for their lost spouse is the thing that brings quality of life to them. And it's a very simple thing, but it can make a huge difference in whether I can get out of my apartment to do that or if I can't. So these kind of regenerative factors are things that could improve quality of life for people. I also don't want to ignore resilience. Resilience is the ability to bounce back from something. And I think this is an important one. I don't know anybody who's in their 70s, 80s, or 90s who isn't resilient. By the time you've reached that age in your life, you've experienced loss, you've experienced pain, you've experienced failure, and yet somehow you've soldiered on. So resilience is a big one. And sometimes we have to remind people, you've gotten through this before. We'll figure out how to get through it again. So this is one of the ways that we look at how you identify strengths. You break them down into what are the risk factors, yep, we got those, what are the protective factors, and then what are the regenerative factors. And as I'm working with somebody in a person-centered approach, I really want to try to pay attention to identifying them. I also need an ability to reframe situations. And what I mean by reframe situation is helping people find words that express in their words what they want to have happen. All too often I see people look at, these are the things that are available in the care plan. These are the things from the pull-down menu we can use. These are the goals that we have to put on a form somewhere. By the same token, I've come to understand that if I go into an organization and say, do you have a care plan for your consumers? They'll say, yes, we do. And I'll ask the worker, if I went out and interviewed 10 of your consumers, how many of them do you think could tell me what the goals are of their care plan? And I typically get a surprised look. And ultimately we come to the point where not many. And part of that is because we're stuck between that administrative process and the consumer process. And the administrative process requires that we have articulated goals that can be measured. But for consumers, that might not be the language that they would use. That might not express what they want to have happen. So I need an ability to reframe things, to put them in words that resonate for the consumer and that the consumer and I both understand in the same way. And sometimes this can be taking a negative and turning it into a positive. That is taking a problem and turning the problem into a plan. So I want to go back to the example I gave you earlier about my father having surgery. As he was trying to recover in the hospital, it was very difficult for him. And he was becoming a challenge for some of the people who were caring for him, understandably so. And for him, the problem was that he couldn't control things as well as he wanted to. He wasn't used to people controlling things for him. And part of helping him able to reframe things was helping him think about, what is it that you want to do here? And it's very simple. I want to get back to my garden. Okay, now if you want to get back to your garden, what's the quickest way for us to do that? And as soon as that language was used, he could take these negative experiences and he could turn them into, okay, I've got to get through this period. Yes, you do. It's going to be a tough period right now. I've got to do some of the things they ask me to do even though I don't want to. Yes, you've got to do those things. So I think that's another part of it, is an ability to reframe things for people so that it becomes goal-directed for them. Okay, at this point, I want to break again to see if there are any questions that folks might have. I'd be happy to answer them, or any comments that people might want to make.
Brad, we don't have any questions, and we have about 15 minutes or so until 2:30.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, so we can soldier on.
All right. The last thing I wanted to do was shift gears once again. We talked about an overview of what person-centered meant. We also talked about the acronym PERSON. And now I want to talk a little bit about values dynamics and what a values dynamic really is and how it plays into things. We know that values do play a part in long-term living and person-centered planning because there are numerous goals in long-term living. Some of them are cost containment goals. Some of them are keeping people in their homes. Some of them are, well, they vary a great deal. And the impact of long-term care, unlike acute care, is different because it occurs for extended period of time. So I'm willing to put up with some things that aren't part of my value system if it's for a short period. But if I've got to live with this for the rest of my life, it makes a huge difference. We also know that there are multiple interests and limited resources that have to be accommodated. Last but not least, in our culture, we say that people and believe that people have a moral and legal right to live their life as they choose. Well, the values in a person-centered approach itself stem from the notion of helping people, assisting people in planning and improving their independence and personal self-determination. So by its very nature, it has a core value. This is something people should be able to do. And some of the core values impact on people in different ways. In terms of what's important to this person, well, it might be different than what is important to someone else. Family, safety, meaningful roles, friends, comfort. Well, maybe safety isn't important to me, but it is to somebody else. We know that the core values of person-centered planning strive to put the participant at the center of decision-making, that they're the ones who choose. We also know that one of the core values is that this is contrary to service-centered planning. And this gets complicated for us because we operate on a continuum of services. We tend to think about, well, we have X number of people who are dealing with these kinds of things. Let's put this service in place. Great, that service is in place. Now can we help meet needs at even lower cost by doing different kinds of services? So this notion of continuum of service is something that we've focused on from the administrative side. But the reality is that in person-centered planning, I'm not focused on the services first. Rather, I'm focused on where does the person want to go first. Within this notion of values, I like to call this the values mix. And I said earlier in the presentation that as soon as we work with the consumer, we've brought values into that consumer's world that aren't their values. And they've not explicitly said, oh, yes, bring your values in. It's not something that they consciously think about, something they consciously requested. And we bring in three different kinds of values: worker values, the service system values, and agencies values. I'd like to demonstrate each of the three of these. I'll start with service system values, and I'll look at two examples, 3 values from aging and 3 values from disability. In the aging network, these 3 things we see as important. Quality of life is very important. We think informal supports are desirable, and decisional capacity, from our perspective, is not automatic. See if I can get this slide to go. All right. What I mean by quality of life, well, with age, quality of life remains important. We say people should be able to live in their preferred setting. We know that changes in functional status can put quality of life at risk. And what's interesting about this in terms of functional status is related to ADLs and IADLs. These are almost always directly related to health status. And that's a significant difference from disability. Agencies' informal supports is desirable. We see the use of family and other social networks as an important thing, as a good thing. 2 reasons for this. One is it does have a gatekeeping cost containment element to it. But the second one has to do with social network preservation. The reality is that the older you get, the more your relationships are vertical versus horizontal. What I mean by that is a horizontal relationship are those people who are your age, those people who have lived through some of the same things you have. The older you get, the fewer of those actually exist. Rather, I tend to know people who are younger than I am. And if I can maintain and preserve a network, that's something that we see as desirable in our system. We do not assume decisional capacity. We don't do that because there's a high rate of cognitive impairment and depression. This is especially true for the frailest or the oldest old. So we also see decisional capacity as occurring along a continuum. It's not either or. I can have capacity about one thing at one time, perhaps not have the same level of capacity about that same thing at a different time. You know, an example I like to use is I might have the decisional capacity to say, I know I want my bills paid on time, but I no longer have the capacity to know how to write checks. Well, I do have some decisional capacity, and it does exist, but it's along a continuum. Because of the high rate of cognitive impairment, we're much more reluctant to support what we think are risky decisions based on how safe the individual would be. So this is a value system that aging has, and what you're going to see is it's very different from disability, as an example. All right, so in disability, we're going to look at three. One, the person with the disability knows best. Two, disability is not the same as being sick. And the third one is that decisional capacity is assumed. All right, the person with disabilities knows best. History has shown that whenever somebody else, even if they're well-meaning, if they step in and exert control over somebody, devaluation and dehumanization often tend to be the results. So well-meaning people have tried to do good things with people with disabilities, and in fact, those folks ended up feeling devalued and dehumanized. It became, in effect, a civil rights issue based on issues of self-determination and participant direction. So what that boils down to is if the person with disability knows best, that means that even family members aren't automatically asked to be involved, because sometimes it's the family members who were well-intended but who are actually keeping the person from a level of self-determination that they could have been at. Disability is not the same as being sick. Disability would hold that this has been over-medicalized. Just because I'm blind or I'm deaf or I'm in a wheelchair doesn't mean I'm sick. I'm paralyzed or I'm blind, but I'm not sick. Now, one of the side effects of this is that when we allow people to be sick, we tend to exempt them from normal things. We've all probably done that. Oh, I can't do this. I'm not feeling well. And in our culture, if you're sick, you get excused from things. The negative implication of this in the disability community is people should be excused from the normal kind of responsibilities and activities that others have. This can be a very demeaning and devaluing process without people knowing that they're doing it. In the disability community, decisional capacity is assumed. Because of that, as I mentioned, history of control by others, there's a real issue around, no, I will choose, and I can't let other people assume that I can't choose. I even have the right to make bad choices. That's how strongly this is felt. So it's assumed the person with disability can secure their resources on his or her own. And they have a right to access to information. This is often referred to as advocacy on their part. So I'm not going to automatically assume somebody with disabilities doesn't have capacity. In fact, I'm going to assume just the opposite, that they do have capacity. So we've taken a look at system values and how they can differ. Worker values can differ as well, but they're there. I'm going to use two examples. One's related to cleanliness, and the other is to who should help. You might have one worker who really struggles with what they consider as filth. They honestly believe that everybody can afford a bar of soap, and being dirty is a sign of a personal shortcoming. It's a weakness. I know people who believe this. And you can have people who are very uncomfortable when they're in a place that they consider unclean. So if that worker has those values and bringing it into the house, that's going to be considerably different than worker B, who makes a distinction between something that's dirty or something that's a health hazard. Or somebody who thinks that daily bathing in terms of human history is a relatively recent practice. that people have survived and lived well without daily bathing for a long period of time. And this person might not be uncomfortable when places are unclean. They might be, okay, I can deal with this. I can take a shower when I get home. So you have two different kinds of attitudes related to cleanliness. Now let's look at who should help. Worker A believes that people should turn to family first, and that immediate family actually have a responsibility to help. And I've actually met some people who think that women, in fact, are better helpers than men. Worker B, however, might come in with values that are different. Participants should choose who and what kind of help they want. That shouldn't be chosen for them. And that the immediate family may or may not be a good match for the participant's desires. I recently saw a family situation where the consumer, who was in his 70s, absolutely did not want his daughter caring for him. And this was an issue of roles. His role as a family leader and figure, his daughter shouldn't be doing those things with him. There may be values related to the kind of help that should be delivered, and some should only be delivered by trained professionals. So what we have is two workers with very different values, agencies with different values. The thing that's missing, though, is the consumer values. And in the ideal situation, what we want to do is we want to bring the consumer's values to the forefront, and we want to keep the worker values, the agency values, and the service system values as far out of that as we possibly can. The fact of the matter is they haven't asked for those values to be there. And if I want to do person-centered planning, I have to come to understand what's important to the consumer while keeping all these other values as far out of the mix as I can. So when we come to understand consumer values, we have taken major steps toward understanding person, and we're in a better position to facilitate person-centered planning. So I think I'm coming in at the right time period. I want to thank you all for giving me the opportunity to share my thoughts with you. I'm very serious about this. If you have questions, feel free to email me. My email address is here. Please put the title of this webinar in it so that I know what the email is about, and I'll be happy to respond to it. And Ann, do we have any questions we need to answer at this point?
Yes, we do.
Okay.
The question is, as we deal with individuals and help them develop a plan, and as we deal with the financial constraints on programs, how might we make the person that we're helping, the individuals, feel successful about making progress toward their plan when we may have no funded programs to assist them?
I think that's a good question. I think it's an interesting question in that the assumption is that funded programs are the only thing that might be able to help. I'll be the first one to say, boy, if you have funded programs, that's really nice. I suspect that we're not going to have the luxury of as many funded programs as we do now if our political climate continues the way that it does. For me, this becomes problem solving with the consumer. This becomes a look at, here are the choices we have. We can't get you this service. What else can we do? And this is why I need to have that relationship with the consumer so that they trust me enough that we can get down to nitty-gritty and try to figure out how do we improve and restore, maintain as much quality of life as we can. Sometimes we can't take it as far as we want. And as I said in the beginning, sometimes we see quality of life continue to deteriorate. I can't personalize and take that home because it's not something I did or didn't do. Rather, what I can do is try to figure out, how do I slow this down? If we can't get X, Y, and Z, can we get A, B, and F? They're not as good. They might work, and they might help take the person closer to where they want to be. This is going to take additional skill on the part of the care manager. It's going to take some real understanding of the informal supports that exist in that person's life.
I don't have any other questions up on the screen. Is there anything else that somebody wants? You can type it in while we do closing remarks here. I thank you very much. This has been lots of information, and I'm sure very helpful to everybody on the phone for their clients, perhaps family members. These are difficult these are difficult circumstances, and you've given us a lot of tools to think about how to help the people that we encounter who need the most help, and that's why we're all in this business. We want to just remind you that as we close today, if you will stay on the line for a few minutes, because there'll be a survey that pops up, and it's very important to Brad and to ourselves to know what you felt of what we presented and if there are any questions that you might have. And I just reiterate what Brad said here. If you have any additional questions, please get in touch with him so that he can follow up with things that may be perplexing you from this conversation, because there's lots of great information, but it also raises lots of interesting questions about how we do our work with the older people that we're serving. And I want to thank Karen Thornton here at the New York State Association of Area Agencies on Aging. She's been our technical support for all these webinars and helped all of us who are involved stay on target to do the work we need to be done. And I'll remind you again that the recording and the slides from this presentation will be available at www.agingny.org. Right now the PowerPoint is available, and by tomorrow the recording will be available as well. So happy holidays to all of you, and thank you very much for joining us, and thank you again, Brad, for really very thought-provoking session again this afternoon. We really appreciate it.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you for having me.